I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily. Now, it has been a long couple of years for the folks of Northern Ireland. There's been no functional power-sharing government at Stormont since the Democratic Unionists walked out over concerns about Brexit. But the party's leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, says he is now willing to get back into bed with Sinn Féin. Almost. Later on, we will be focusing specifically on some new Brexit rules imposing border controls on a range of plants and foodstuffs coming here from the EU, and of course the costs to companies and consumers alike. But let's begin with what looks like an end to the political deadlock at the Northern Ireland Assembly. Well, joining us from outside Stormont, where there may soon be some activity, our senior Ireland correspondent, David Blevins. David, good to see you. I mean, this has been a long time coming, hasn't it?
Yes, 2 years Northern Ireland has been without power-sharing administration. The Democratic Unionists walked out of devolution in protest at the establishment of a trade border in the Irish Sea. But of course, that for many people was the inevitable consequence of Brexit. It was always going to require a border somewhere, and when Boris Johnson agreed to that border going in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they felt the only way they could vent their frustration was to call a halt to the political administration at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement.
For those of us not as au fait with Northern Irish politics, remind us what the DUP's concern was. Because, I remember Boris Johnson telling the DUP directly that there would not be a border down the Irish Sea. But that was a consequence of his desire to, in his own words, get Brexit done.
That is exactly right. He was not going to achieve a deal with the EU without a border somewhere, because the EU, of course, had to protect its single market for goods. And the way Brussels did that was to push for a border in the Irish Sea rather than the restoration of a land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, because they felt that would be in contrast to the good workings of the Good Friday Agreement, to put it, I think, mildly.
Yeah.
And therefore, Boris Johnson capitulated, some would suggest, and the DUP felt very betrayed by that, because their issue was not just about the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but it was over that old thorny constitutional question of where does Northern Ireland's political future lie? Is it part of the UK, or is it as part of a united Ireland? And many felt that trade border would create a kind of economic divergence that could hasten the day when there would be a referendum on Irish unity.
So the Democratic Unionists were digging their heels in. We've had 2 years of atrophy in the building behind you. So how on earth has Sir Geoffrey Donaldson been persuaded that, power sharing might again be a good idea?
Well, we await the fine detail, but he has made some very big claims about what he says has been agreed with the UK government. He says the agreement will mean there are, and I quote, zero checks on goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and remaining here in Northern Ireland. That sounds like quite a departure from what Rishi Sunak agreed with the EU in the Windsor Framework 11 months ago. But perhaps it has been achieved. The other thing Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is claiming is that EU law will no longer automatically apply here in Northern Ireland. Now, that will raise a few eyebrows in Westminster among the Eurosceptics, because they will be concerned that Rishi Sunak has watered down his Brexit, if you like, in order to secure the restoration of power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. So we'll be looking very carefully, scrutinising the deal very carefully when it's finally published.
Yeah, I can imagine Conservative MPs here looking, as you say, very, very closely at this. But Unionists in Northern Ireland themselves certainly don't speak with one voice on this particular issue. Indeed, aren't there rumblings from within the DUP itself that what is going on is anathema to them, that again, it's not going quite far enough, that again, they may have a closer relationship with the European Union than they do with the rest of the UK?
Yes, and Neil, you've been observing Northern Ireland for long enough to know that no matter what the issue is, it always comes back to the same tricky constitutional question of whether or not Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom is secure. Of course, nationalists are constantly pressing for a referendum on Irish unity. Unionists are constantly seeking to secure Northern Ireland's position as an integral part of the United Kingdom. that's really what has caused the angst, and it remains to be seen if this will be enough to bring all of the unionists back into the fold. But right now, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the DUP leader, does face divisions outside the party and even inside the party. This has by no means been easy for him, but he has taken a leap of faith in a bid to see power sharing restored, and that's because he's under enormous pressure because of the difficulties, the crisis, if you like, within public services, especially in Northern Ireland, without a government having been in place.
So how have the past 2 years been for the people of Northern Ireland? Do you know, I suspect there are many folks out there who think that actually, do you know what? Politics would be a lot better if you got rid of the politicians. But in Northern Ireland, I suspect the experiment that is probably proved that not to be the case.
I think the kindest way I can put it is that we have limped along for the last 2 years from legislation to legislation, and that's because the UK government has constantly shifted the deadline. They know that it would be virtually impossible to simply flick a switch and return to direct rule from Westminster the way Northern Ireland was governed before the Good Friday Agreement existed. Bear in mind that there is now a nationalist First Minister designate. So when you have a Sinn Féin First Minister designate, that is a clear indication that the demographics have changed. So if we had reverted back to direct rule from Westminster, there would almost certainly have had to be an increased role for the Irish government, and that would only fuel the angst among unionists. So the only way we've got by is by the Northern Ireland Secretary constantly granting himself a little bit of extra power in order to push through budgets in Northern Ireland and to take critical decisions in Northern Ireland. But there's been no comparison between that and the devolution we had beforehand.
I mean, David, you've just mentioned it yourself, but standing in front of that grand old building at Stormont, reflect for us, if you can, on the fact that we will soon, if all goes according to plan, have in Michelle O'Neill Sinn Féin's first time taking the job of First Minister.
It would be difficult to exaggerate the significance of that, the potential for yet another historic moment in Northern Ireland, a term that is, I dare say, overused as a result of the peace process. But Michelle O'Neill, 2 months after the power-sharing government here collapsed, topped the poll in the Northern Ireland Assembly election, and she is poised to become the first nationalist to hold the office of First Minister in Northern Ireland. Now, that again will be difficult for many unionists, particularly hardline unionists. Remember, for many years, Sinn Féin was described and regarded as the political wing of the Provisional IRA, and Michelle O'Neill is the leader of Sinn Féin here at Stormont. And if she takes that position, many hardline unionists would say the DUP is facilitating that, because of course she can't become First Minister unless the DUP is prepared to nominate a Deputy First Minister. They're now poised to do that too, and that is an indication again of how the demographics have changed, the fact that the DUP is prepared to recognise the outcome of that democratic election back in 2022. But in terms of the wider significance, it also creates the potential for a Sinn Féin First Minister in Northern Ireland. And if the party succeeds in the way it hopes, there is potential also for a Sinn Féin Taoiseach, a Sinn Féin Prime Minister south of the Irish border. Mary Lou McDonald's been doing very well in the polls recently. Yes, it dropped a little at the weekend, and there is some debate around that. But can you just imagine if there was a Sinn Féin Prime Minister in Dublin and a Sinn Féin First Minister in Belfast? If that doesn't hasten a referendum on Irish unity, I don't know what would.
David, you know me. I hate to put correspondents on the spot and ask them to predict the future. But is this definitely going to happen? I mean, we have had fits and starts over the past couple of years.
My view is that it would be very difficult at this point, I think, for the Democratic Unionist Party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, to row back. There is some hope at long last in Northern Ireland that the politics of power sharing at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement are about to come back on track. That will allow them to address the crisis in public services. The UK government has committed an eye-watering £3.3 billion to support an incoming administration here. I think, given all of that, one has to assume that the DUP are fairly confident that the UK government is going to do what it has promised to do. And therefore, I think we will see power sharing back, yes.
Back in a moment when we'll take a look at what's about to happen to food and flowers coming here from the EU. Welcome back. Think Brexit got done? Think again. New rules are being introduced which, for the first time, impose border controls on plenty of food and flowers coming to the UK from the EU. And, of course, it will have an effect on Northern Ireland as well. Our business correspondent, Paul Kelso, is back in the Daily Podcast studio. And on your favourite topic, of course, Brexit.
Yeah. Indeed, Brexit border controls. I hope everyone's sitting down.
What are these new changes and when are they coming in?
Right, so we're nearly 8 years after the vote. Brexit's done, right? Well, actually, it's not for EU exporters who are sending stuff to the UK. So for British businesses importing stuff from the EU, Brexit hasn't even begun. And it starts Jan 31st, Wednesday of this week, where there will be the first of a staged series of customs checks and declarations required for what are termed medium risk plant and animal products, which in plain English means food and some cut flowers. So there are 5 types of cut flowers, very common ones, orchids, chrysanthemums and the like, and a load of dairy produce, cheese, eggs, frozen and chilled meat and fish, all of which could carry some risk of disease in terms of food and biosecurity threat in terms of plants. They're worried about things called leaf mites, which can destroy the foliage. You will have to get a health certificate for your cut flowers or your food product. If you're a British importer, you will have to get the EU side of the deal has to get a local vet or plant inspector to provide a bespoke declaration that your herd of goats, which has produced your goat's cheese, is safe and free of disease, and for the plants that there's no nasties in there. And that has to be provided before the goods can be let into the UK. Then in 3 months' time, at the end of April, there will be physical checks on a quota of each of those products at the British border.
OK, simply put, why? How have we managed to get away with not doing these things and not being ravaged by some bioplague being imported with a bunch of chrysanthemums?
Is a good question. I'll give you the example from the Netherlands. They would tell you, and they would say this, wouldn't it? It's adding cost to their processes, but they're unnecessary. They say plants, say they import some stuff from Ecuador, 100% of it's checked when it gets off a plane at Schiphol, and then it gets a health certificate to be sold within the EU anyway. They then check it in their factory. Now what they're doing is putting in the corner of the factory, so a separate inspector comes to do the British paperwork, another process. Could be that 6 hours later, when it comes out the other side of the tunnel, it'll get checked again. The reason DEFRA say is that it is largely 2 elements. The main one is biosecurity. They need to have checks to protect the UK, which is an island and has got a natural defence around it, from stuff we don't want in our food chain or in our plant chain. They also say it will help level the playing field for British companies, and this has been the case. Remember, for anyone exporting from the UK to the EU, from day one, they faced all these barriers, so it will level the playing field.
But aren't we in a state of regulatory alignment? I mean, don't we have the same standards and controls as our brothers on the continent?
So I've checked this repeatedly with everyone. There has been zero divergence in the jargon. There are no different regulations. We are exactly as we were. So these processes, it can feel bureaucratic. When I've asked for where's the evidence of risk, you get quite hard pushback saying Britain needs to control its borders and these are worthwhile. And they stress they are trying to minimise the disruption.
I mean, look, 2 things occur to me. One, you add checks, you're adding costs, as you've already alluded to. Second, if you're adding checks, you're possibly adding delays. If we're talking about goods like flowers, fresh cut flowers, foodstuffs and all the rest of it, I mean, these are things that have a literal shelf life.
Absolutely, they do. To reflect that, the health declarations, the health passport for the cut flowers only lasts 48 hours because after that, they're not usable. There's cost. The cost is, how much does a vet inspection cost? Well, it costs £50 to £100 here, about €50 to €100 on the continent. That could be per consignment or per item within the consignment. I've spoken to a wholesaler at New Covent Garden Market who's got 28 different kinds of flour, that one way or another will need checking. He reckons he could be looking at £1,000 for customs checks on an invoice value of £7,000. He's talking nearly 20% on his costs coming in. The delay point is one that they're really worried about. If paperwork's wrong, it is not allowed to enter the UK. So it's how it's going to work. When they're pulled aside, they reckon the guidance is that's guaranteed 4 hours. Now, if your plants leave Holland at midnight, a bit earlier, to be on the other side of the tunnel and in London or at market elsewhere for 2 a.m. when the florists come in, you've got bouquets for a wedding to sort and it's held up for 4 hours, that supply chain is interrupted.
And of course, all of these costs, presumably, are going to be passed on to the consumer. Costs, be it for those inspections that need to take place, costs for the insurance that presumably companies will be taking out on their loads, the cost of the loads that will be lost because at some point there will be delays. I mean, we're all going to be paying a lot more for stuff that comes from just the other side of the channel.
We are, and it's the point that's made, whichever end of this you look at. I happen to have spent some time in the Netherlands. They can't see any way where the cost doesn't end up with the final producer.
Paul, why don't you just pause just for a second whilst we explore those real-world outcomes with someone directly affected. Patricia Michelson is the founder of La Fromagerie, which has been importing artisanal cheese for years. Patricia, great to have you on, and indeed to get your take on all of this. Let's just speak about the practicalities of the changes that are coming in. Of course, new rules mean, checks at the border in a way in which you haven't had, I would have thought, for the majority of the 40 years of your business. I mean, Patricia, how much do you anticipate this affecting your margins, your profits?
Oh, my goodness. We're talking about it now, how things have been affected, because we had to put up prices because of the paperwork following Brexit. So with this one, I would think that we will have to look at least 5% on top of our current prices, at least. I don't know. We'll have to see. It just depends how this paperwork pans out, how easy it is to utilise, and how our producers are affected by it as well. By the time's constraints. The actual bit of paper doesn't cost any money. It's the people involved putting it together and sending it off and getting it stamped and then returning it and all the rest of it, and the transport documents and everything else.
How much more difficult will this make doing business?
What it might mean is that we just don't do as many of these things as we have in the past. Try to streamline what we do to make it more cost effective. I mean, these extra checks, they're not necessary in the reality of it all, because veterinary certificates have already been done. They're done meticulously on the continent, and they're already there. This is just doing them again for another piece of paper for the UK.
Patricia, thank you. Paul?
I mean, there's another element to this we should probably tap into. I believe this has been in consultation for 3 years.
Right. Last
week, unbeknownst and unannounced to the industry, a host of fruit and veg were added to the list without fanfare by DEFRA. But for now, and this can get complicated, they'll be treated as if they're low risk. So none of the checks we've been talking about will apply.
So they're voluntarily waiving
They're voluntarily
checks.
waiving those
Right.
because they don't want disruption. But they said at 3 months' notice, that could change.
Why on earth would the government, in the shape of DEFRA, why would they not give industry the heads up? Why would they suddenly just decide, as you say, 10 days out to change the playing field? I don't understand why they would do
And
this.
I have to say, nor do I. And I've asked, it was journalists elsewhere who first spotted this. We followed it up. In fact, the rules changed twice in 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And I've spoken to the Cabinet Office, to DEFRA. No minister has been made available. It's not really clear to me why it has happened. These rules have been delayed, we should remember, 5 times in 3 years. Now, there's been some big challenges to the UK supply chains, COVID, the war in Ukraine. The cost of living has been a permanent worry. But they have had plenty of chances to get this right. And I think the issue is that industry has been walked up the hill so many times and then walked back down. I'm not sure many will actually believe this is going to happen till it actually happens. But certainly in Europe, people have been receiving, translated leaflets about how to handle stuff you're shipping to the UK, and then it's not happened. And you can imagine that many won't adjust to this on the morning. It should be said, on the first day, Cabinet Office saying that they're going to be pragmatic. They're not going to be turning people back for minor lapses in paperwork. They're going to give this time to work. But it is finally a real-world impact at the border of Brexit.
Not for the first time on this podcast. I feel like I've been taking crazy pills. I understand the vote to leave the European Union. I understand the desire after that vote took place to redefine Brexit as including leaving the single market and the customs union as well. But Brexit was designed to free us up, to take back control, to get rid of red tape.
It's hard to argue with that. Customs and trade is fearsomely complicated.
Of course.
And the answer usually to a straight question is, well, it depends. And even those who are absolutely steeped in this have to work their way through it slowly. But, this is, even by the government's own figures, they say this is going to add £330 million cost to industry of finally imposing a border with Europe. I spoke to the Dutch flower industry, huge industry, basically it's the heart of flowers in Europe. It's a £9 billion industry.
I've been in one of the warehouses. It's just incredible place.
$1 billion of that ends up here. Their spokesman told me if Brexit was about cutting down red tape, Brussels red tape, he called it, and bringing down costs, I don't see the point, because anything our industry has seen since the vote is London red tape and additional cost and bureaucracy. And it's hard to argue with that. It is the case. We've imposed our own red tape and our own costs to have control of the border, to be fair. It's what was promised.
Paul, thanks very much. And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again soon.